Hi everybody, I'm John August. I'm the fusion candidate for Bennelong. We've got some big ideas in terms of how to change the economy, how to change society, basically to make life a bit more livable for all of us. So I'm going to be talking with Owen, who's also in the party. We're going to be talking about tariffs, about innovation, about housing affordability, the quality of life, how our infrastructure is going, power, solar panels and batteries and so on. So please join us for a bit of a chat, which we're now going to get into.
So John, the Fusion Party has some pretty fundamental changes in terms of economic policies, housing policies, but I guess, everyday people, people who aren't economists, they're going to be wondering, how is this actually going to benefit me in the real world?
Well, you basically do want to have more economic activity, more wealth, and more what you might call social economic productivity. Because, people do talk about not just growth, but inclusive growth. Mm-hmm. So we are basically saying that you want to have a better life for people, but you don't want to have it at the expense of pollution or, workers being screwed over or whatever. And I mean, part of that story is that in our economy, there's too much energy being poured into speculation in property and too little sort of energy into actually doing worthwhile things. And what you want to do is turn around the tax system so that those sorts of things are encouraged. So there is the thing of housing. We've basically got a whole lot of construction going on and a whole lot of good houses are getting ripped down, and they're basically being built for profit rather than being built to give people better lives. And we're not sort of marrying up that with a decent amount of infrastructure expansion to match that. So we have a situation where, quite apart from like how our lives are, whether we're wealthy or whatever, but you have a decent number of suburbs where basically the people who want to work in the schools, who want to work in the hospitals, want to work at the police stations, the fire stations, they can't actually afford to live in that area. And first off, it's a bit sad that they can't, and second, they're obviously driving all over Sydney, or I should say driving all over our capital cities, sort of making the roads more congested. So it's sort of all these things are accumulating together, and
I guess we're saying that there are these incentives for houses to be subject to price speculation, but I guess not enough incentives for the government to actually make it a nice place to live.
That's right, yes. There's, I think there was a US economist, he spoke about private affluence and public poverty, that basically our streets would be pretty drab, but we'd have these flash driveways,
This guy is American, I'm guessing?
Yes, that's right, yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's interesting, I guess, the US isn't really a go-to example of where we should be taking our policies. I guess especially, do you have any opinions about the tariffs at the moment? I mean, how does that fit into, economic theory in general? Is this something we should be copying?
No, well, basically, I think, Henry George, who I have mixed feelings about, but I think one of his maxims was that we apply tariffs to do the same thing we do to our economy when we go at war with someone else. Now, look, let's just say, there is a more complicated picture that, trade, change in industry can cause disruption, and that is some truth to that. But in broad terms, tariffs are going to mess up your economy. Like, I suppose, going off on a bit of a tangent here, but there are stories of manufacturers in Canada who do actually, take US goods, then make something and then sell it back to the US. And this whole situation where they are actually using US raw materials, making something and then selling it back to the US, that now their market to the US is being cut. So it's sort of basically the US is shooting itself in the foot in so many ways. And there is the economic theory that the whole world benefits by everybody doing what they're good at, and there's a decent amount of truth in that. Obviously, you don't want to overstate it, but equally what Trump has been doing is basically harming himself and harming everybody else. And that's my summary of it. So sometimes I do endorse what the mainstream economists say. I mean, they're not all talking nonsense,
I wonder actually, if we think about, what each economy does well. I mean, I'm one of the reasons I got involved in politics is I see Australia used to love innovation. If we think about the CSIRO inventing Wi-Fi, we look on our $50 note. It has, David Uniapon, a mechanical engineer, with his mechanised shears right next to him. But Australian investment in research and development has been declining so much, and so we don't see much advanced manufacturing in Australia, and it's something that the right-wing parties, they love talking about it as well. How do we bring back Australian manufacturing? What do you think of what can Australia be doing well in the next, say, 20 years, and how do we make this happen then?
Well, let me go off on a little bit of a tangent, because it's my understanding that when the overseas economists rather, will talk about the Asian miracle, the tiger miracle, the Irish miracle, and so on, they will talk about the Australian miracle, and they will say that our miracle is basically built on construction and population growth, and that's not a healthy thing for the economy to rely on.
Well, it's a bubble, many people say.
Yes, well, let's say there's also a few other things going on in the Australian economy. Obviously, there's mining, there's farming, and there's also niche manufacturing. And I would say that there's a decent amount of niche manufacturing that you wouldn't notice, specialised things that we do actually make and sell. And there's, unfortunately, I think it's a lovely thing to recognise. I'm not sure it's a big thing in terms of the whole economy, but it is there. And certainly we do have that base there, and we can actually encourage that and develop that. And yes, you're right, the CSIRO, we used to have a stronger tradition of innovation, and we've somehow lost our way there. So it's certainly worth encouraging, but you don't want to encourage it in a naive sort of way. I guess you want to get into the depths of it.
Oh, I guess in terms of innovation, I mean, Fusion has quite a few policies that would explicitly, redirect the economy, wouldn't we?
Yes, well, I'll let you talk about that. Tell
I mean, I was thinking, for instance, of in our climate policy, for instance, we're advocating for, how can we use the government to encourage precision fermentation, for instance. So the idea is, many people would be familiar with, yeast cells growing, beer, for instance. Casein, for instance, is one of the proteins in milk. That's already been grown by similar processes. Insulin used to come from livestock, but now it's being grown through precision fermentation. It doesn't just result in less cruelty and more efficiency. The insulin made this way, we're talking orders of magnitude more output than what could be achieved through killing animals.
Certainly, now that you've mentioned it, I suppose we have had a lot of high-end medical research, HPV vaccines, cancers, these sorts of things that have been developed in Australia. And you were talking about the US, and one of the things about, say, EpiPens or various other things, the way that intellectual property is so abused in the US. On the one hand, they have innovation, and they also have the abuse of that innovation through their intellectual property laws. So
through the patent trolls.
Yeah, patent trolls and so on. And I think that's much more of a US thing. And when you're saying, look, the US is not someone to follow, that is very true. In some ways, their economy has some lovely things to reflect upon, just how much they do have a venture capital scene and they are into innovation. At the same time as there's so many weird things going on in the US economy that you shake your head at. So it's certainly a mixture, and you certainly don't want to emulate the US economy whole as follows, particularly now with them going a bit funny and going off with their tariffs and whatnot. And I think it's sort of evidence that in a very broad sense, the US is no longer a trustworthy partner. Because I suppose I'm going off on a bit of a diversion into foreign policy, but I think the US were always a bit of a mafia boss, that you kiss the ring and they mostly look after you, sort of thing, right? But now it's sort of like the mafia boss has gone off and read books, conspiracy theory books, and I don't mean, to do with vaccines, but more to do with UFOs and contrails and that sort of thing. And now he's come back and he thinks he knows how the world works, and oh boy, it's getting crazy.
Well, actually, it's interesting you mentioned venture capital. I mean, that's certainly one of the ways the US has really been succeeding. I guess as well, it's worth mentioning. So I used to live in the US for 7 years myself. 2 years in Seattle, 5 years in New York. I'm a software engineer. I've been involved in startups, and I guess John, you must be familiar as well. Like the startup ecosystem in the US, there's just so much more funding there. They take you more seriously, as well. Even the concept of failure. I mean, in Australia, if you try to make a startup and it doesn't work, there's just more of a sense of shame. like, you know,
Well,
you failed.
Yeah, obviously, I this is something that I more watch from the outside, and I think you obviously have experience a lot closer to it. But my understanding is the venture capitalists in the US are much more willing to take a gamble. Like, they'll throw money at 10 firms, and maybe 9 of them will fail, but they do have a reasonable expectation that the one that does succeed will really fly, and they're willing to take that sort of a gamble. And then the other thing is that, you know, if you fail at one venture capital operation, you know, you might find someone who's willing to throw money at you for something else. But I think probably it does help if you've got a story to say, well, I did this and these are the lessons that I've learned, and I wouldn't be repeating my same mistake again. But apparently, even if you fail at one venture, it's quite possible to find money from someone else to back you for another venture.
It's seen as a learning experience. Yeah, I mean, running a startup requires, you know, so many skills. It requires so much focus that like one of the only ways of getting that skill set is to just do it.
Yes, okay.
And so it's interesting. You know, in Australia, like, you know, so fewer people are pursuing startups. There's less money available for it. And you see, like the Victorian government, for instance, they wanted to encourage it. So the Victorian government set up their own venture capital firm. You know, they're choosing which startups to fund and giving them money. But I think it's crazy because, you know, that's not one of the skill sets of government. You know, government is known for moving slowly, for having a lot of red tape. Whereas, as you said, these venture capitalists in the US, you know, they're very willing to take risks. Yes. So it's the complete opposite skill set. And you see as well, who got appointed on the board of this venture capital firm run by the Victorian government. And it's not typical people like startup people, it's typical government people. And so, you know, there's a long time horizon to make these bets work, but, you know, I wouldn't put my money behind the Victorian State Government Venture Capital Fund.
Well, it is one of those things that a moderate number of ventures that have government, they want to have a few people with a business background on the board or whatever, but from your telling me they're not actually doing that. It does seem to be a bit strange to my point of view. But having said that, if there's so little local funding for venture capital, well, maybe this is like the only game in town, and you can wish them luck, I suppose. You know?
I guess there's also a popular model from governments is to give out grants. But a problem I have with that is, you know, the company already has to exist in order to get the government grant. And so, you know, there's this company that's been like sort of trotting along, not massively successful because, you know, like why would you give a grant to a company that's already rich? Yeah. So there's this company that's not quite going bankrupt and they get government money thrown at it. If you compare, like, you know, Summer Fusion's policies would, you know, change the ecosystem. We wouldn't be
I
picking
suppose
individual
what
winners.
you want to do is find a business that has potential and is held back by a lack of funds, that has a vision for where to go, and then you give it some money and ideally it can grow to the next level. I mean, that would be what I would think you would be trying to do.
I guess, actually, if we go back to, so we were saying before in terms of housing, that, you know, a lot of money is being squandered in Australia, you know, speculating on real estate. Yes. It could be going to more productive assets. And so, you know, for people who haven't yet read Fusion's housing policy, so some of the things there, we would be reducing some of the incentives given towards homeowners. So owner-occupiers, for instance, if you live in the home that you purchase, you don't have to pay any capital gains tax. And so, you know, we see, you know, house prices keep on skyrocketing. I would argue it's a big reason behind it is because there are all these tax incentives. So if everybody buys homes with the idea they're going to go up, then these homeowners sort of force it to happen. They refuse to sell at a loss.
Well, the other thing is that, you know, lots of the money, the lazy money, gets poured into the property market where if circumstances were different, it might find more productive outlets. Now, certainly going on a bit of a tangent here, I think it is sad the way so much of our resources are going into gambling. I think there's several parameters where you say, you know, there's the greatest density of poker machines. I forget what the exact figures are, but there are a decent number of things where Australia leads the world in terms of gambling. And I have to say that part of me does actually say, look, you know, people should have the freedom to do whatever on their own initiative, and I can see that. But at the same time, when you have a big industrial machine that's basically well-oiled to help separate people from their money, you wonder how much of that personal decision is being made. And I would say, look, we are struggling to catch up on infrastructure, be that roads or electricity or whatever. And my glib paraphrase is that rich people need to spend less money on yachts, and less well-off people need to gamble less money, and we pour that money into developing our infrastructure for our economy. And that's sort of me sticking my neck out there, I guess.
Well,
Yes.
actually, yeah, so gambling gets very demonised. I would argue, though, as we said, Australia has, let's say more gambling than most other countries.
Yes.
Instead of just trying to kill it off, why can't we redirect it? I mean, remember, when Robin Hood, the app was new, one of the revolutionary things about it was there were no trading fees for buying shares.
Yeah.
And so I maybe it was different in Australia, I was in the US at the time, but, that quickly caught on. And many people who would have otherwise turned to, let's say betting on the footy,
Yeah.
they were instead betting on the share market. And
That's a more productive outlet. And before I sound like too much of a wowser, look, I do gamble in the sense of blackjack and poker, so
Okay.
I do these things, I do a bit of gambling myself, but at the same time, I feel that it's a personal choice, a decision that I've made. And when you have so many people doing that, and it's so easy with gambling available on every street corner now. This is going way back in the dim dark depths of history. Now, I wasn't either alive or really processing things, but once upon a time there was a so-called SB bookie scene.
Oh, yeah.
And you'd go to these sort of places, and one of the things is that you'd have to show some initiative to find these places, and they'd only be open for certain hours of the day. I do believe it was like 6 to 8 or something like that. So it was available, but you had to use a decent amount of initiative to access the services.
It is all sports betting, yeah.
Yeah, that's sports betting. And for me, that was a nice balance, because yes, you could do it if you really wanted to, but you had to show some initiative to actually do it. Now, the problem with that scene was there was so much corruption of police, judges, politicians, and so on, and that was too high a price to pay. But notice, I am willing to recognise the good part of that scene, that yes, it was there, but you had to use some initiative to access that service. So I think that was a better balance in terms of access, though yes, the cost in corruption and messing up society was too high.
But, yeah, so I guess going back to the shares before, I see, it's essentially gambling. Like, as I said, it's the same people. And so one of the changes in our housing policy, actually, so in the US, they have this notion of a sophisticated investor.
Yes.
And in Australia, they have the same thing. It's called a different name, though. Doesn't matter. Let's just call it sophisticated investor.
Yeah.
But basically, it's rich people.
Yeah.
If you have enough money to lose, then you can invest in, say, you can be an angel funder of a startup, for instance.
Yes.
And the regulators are happy with that model, because basically, if you have this money to lose and you don't really understand what you're doing, at least you're not going to be devastated as a result of it.
Yeah.
And so, there would be many people who, their life savings might only, be tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
But if they're interested in startups, like, why are you stopping them? They might know about this. So a recent change, the US is bringing in...
Well, my one regulation, I don't know if it's built into it, is that you should never invest so much that if it all goes south, then you're destitute. You've got to make sure that you've always got some money spare just in case. I mean, I'm not sure what the regulations are like, but that is something I would build into them if I were involved.
Could do. But yeah, so one of the changes happening now in the US is you can take an exam. You can, get all the questions right. If you prove that, you understand how investing works, then you can become a sophisticated investor, even if you're not rich. And so you can start investing in startups. And, we've recommended that in our housing policy as well. The way it fits into housing is, as we said, all this money is being pumped into housing instead of more productive investments. Yeah. And so, so we would be freeing up capital for startups in Australia amongst anyone, not just rich people. Another of the big changes in our housing policy is the Livret A. So it's a government bond. The same thing exists in France. It's massively popular. 80% of French people have their money in a Livret A.
Is that what proportion of their whole savings? Some
No,
proportion of their savings?
it's capped. You can only invest 29,000 euros. So it gives tax-free returns. The money there gets invested in social housing, loans to French companies. So we're suggesting the Australian Livret A would be used to invest in public housing, infrastructure projects, city building, high-speed rail. And so, you know, you look at like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, they love investing in city building. If you offered, if you offered Australians, would you rather bet on the state of origin, or would you rather invest in a high-speed rail link between Sydney and Melbourne, which is going to get a better return, which is going to attract more attention?
Okay, there's partially return, but and I can see that what you're saying is a good thing. But one of the benefits is gambling is you press the button and you get to see the results in the next 1 or 2 days. So
you're saying everyday Aussies wouldn't want to invest in city building?
Well, there is a degree, I think, of willing participation in superannuation. Like there's compulsory super and then there's optional super. So, some Australians are obviously investing via particular vehicles that I guess are slightly different. So it is, let's just say, what I'm trying to say is it is quite possible you'll attract that money for investment, but whether it's going to attract all the people who would gamble on the horses and then they place the bet and then see the result in the next 15 minutes, I guess I wonder about that. But still, it's a matter of the culture. You could say that you could try to redirect that psychological energy and say, I know that you used to be gambling on horses, but why don't you gamble on the stock market and you can see it grow, you can see changes, and if things work out well, you'll have a bonus at the end of the day. So that's obviously, I guess, the way to sell it. But the thing is, it depends on if the economic commentators you talk to. Some people, when they want to be derogatory about the mainstream economy and the share market, they just say, "Oh, it's just a gambler's den." So that's how they try to delegitimize it by comparing it to gambling. So I guess it's an interesting thing, I suppose.
Yeah.
Your approach is, I guess, thinking that having companies, having share markets, having stocks and so on is a good thing for society. And I would say it can be good, but what if you have a company that is selling nonsense, vitamins people don't need, or books on the secret language of birthdays, or even services involving gambling, and then they've got a service promoting gambling. Because I think you normally hail from Melbourne, and I understand there is this movement in AFL called Follow the Game, Not the Odds. Are you aware of it?
Well, I guess that fits into the idea of, let's kill off gambling in Australia.
Oh, no. I would say, look, first off, I'm not an AFL myself, so I only am aware of this from the periphery. But my understanding is they're not trying to say that people shouldn't gamble on AFL. It's just that the fact that the odds are flashed up every ad break and the game seems to be dominated by gambling, that's a problem. Now, look, me in my more generalised sense sort of say, look, if someone wants to place a bet at the start of the game and see things through, and maybe they lose some money, maybe they make some money, well, good luck to them, as long as they're making that decision before the game starts, and when they experience the game, it's not polluted by all this advertising about gambling. So notice I'm saying it's a matter of degree, and I think the concern with follow the game, not the odds, is not that people shouldn't gamble, but that the experience has become polluted.
Yeah. Actually, John, do you want to take a step back?
Yeah.
So I guess when we focus on all these, vices, and say, like, why are Australians, gambling away their houses, their life savings? I see, these vices as an outlet for a depressing life. If people were, the park around us, it's a beautiful day today here in Bennelong. Many people, though, they're struggling with debts. Having a happy life is easier said than done. Many of Fusion's policies come with this. The ultimate aim is, let's make it easier for Australians to have a happy, fulfilling life.
Yes, yes.
Policies like universal basic income, for instance.
Yes.
I guess, for people who aren't aware of UBI and its implications, do you want to walk us through?
Okay, well, there's different emphases, but I would say the Pirate Party view of universal basic income is that everybody gets a certain wad of cash per week regardless. And then if you make a certain amount of money, then you start to pay tax, but it's a flat rate of tax. So this is a combination of, I guess, valid points that you might say your left-wing and your right-wing perspective says. Your left-wing perspective is saying, we should support people with welfare and give them options, and that's obviously your universal basic income. But then the other thing is that if you have a flat incline with your taxation, then you have an incentive to go out, earn and make that money.
It avoids the welfare traps.
It avoids welfare traps, poverty traps, that's correct. And also, you know, there are some people who have all of these what ifs about a universal basic income. And let me be honest that certainly we in the Pirate Party, we don't want to stuff up the economy, because whenever you have a spending plan, you know, the first criticism is how are you going to pay for that? And obviously we want to do this without having inflation. And the point is, you can have a universal basic income without inflation, but you can't without cost just throw a large enough amount of money at someone that they suddenly live well, because we don't want to just give them money.
Oh, I guess that's why it's a basic income.
Yeah, we don't just want to give them money. We want to make sure that once you go out in the market, life is still moderately affordable. The housing accommodation isn't too much. The cost of goods aren't too much. So you can live a reasonable life on that universal basic income, but you still have reasons to apply yourself and sort of go out there and do more. But some people say that in the US, some of these subsidies are more excuses for firms to like not pay their employees a lot because they know that things are going to get topped up by government.
Oh, I've heard, yeah, like at Walmart, for instance. I think Walmart helps you apply for all the government benefits.
Yes, that's right.
Because their wages are so low.
Now, this is, I guess, a bit of a thing about the dynamic of the situation, because notice you do have gig workers who you know, there is concern over how unstable their income is and how their negotiating position is not very good. But if you think about it, your typical tradie is in a sense doing gig work.
Yeah.
You know, here's a job, I'll do this. Here's a job, I'll do that. And in that case, our tradie has got relative economic power, and it's not a problem. But the other people who are working in gig economies do not have the same economic power. So they sort of, I guess, get short shrift out of that. So, so what I'm trying to say is that we want to, in the ideal, you actually give people enough universal basic income that they can take a job or walk away from it. Now, if you have the option of walking away from the job, then that employer has to offer you a decent amount of money for you to make the effort of doing it. And that's where you get out of that Walmart trap that you're describing. Now, the thing is, it's a bit of a difficult thing to actually have a sort of a universal basic income where you can do that, and you want to grow the economy enough to the point where it is. But at start off, at least you get rid of poverty traps, and people don't have to jump through bureaucratic hoops to get it. And that's a definite saving, a definite improvement in the quality of life that you have.
Yeah.
And as things develop, hopefully the quality of life will improve to that point. But you know, there's obviously lots of different models around of job guarantee of universal basic income. And the nice thing about universal basic income is that you could vary it. You could have a thing where you sort of put up your hand and say, look, I want to start up a lawn mowing business. I don't have the money for lawn mowing. And you could say, look, I want to get 10% of my income for like the next 3 months, so I have a lot of cash, I go off and buy the lawnmower and I can start up a business. So that is all, dare I say, what you might call an Islamic or venture capital style of finance, where you go out and get a loan, but it's not the idea that like you really have to pay it off regardless. I mean, the person taking the risk with you hopes that your business venture will prosper. If it prospers, they get their cut.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't prosper, they are going to share a decent amount of the risk. So the point is, if you are letting people, I mean, I'm obviously, I guess the obvious story is, you know, someone is buying a lawnmower and doing lawn mowing, but there's lots of things you do where you can buy a few bunch of things and go out and do that.
You need the upfront capital, yeah.
You need the upfront capital. And like to be a plumber, even assuming that you get qualified as a plumber, there's a whole lot of tools you've got to buy, you've got to have the truck to run around in. And that is one of the things, you want to have a certain amount of flexibility in the universal basic income. Either you can have a claim on future increments for a lump sum, or you get sort of a venture style capital loan to sort of get you to that. So I think enabling people's personal initiative through the universal basic income is also a good thing. And I suppose it is a matter of culture, and you want to develop that culture where people are willing to take that initiative and take that step and become, you know, independent entrepreneurs. But let's say, look, I myself, I am involved in bush regeneration, so there's the opportunities for applying yourself in a community way that helps things. And if we want to expand out to say, well, you can start up a business and things will go forward. Now, I will check myself a little bit and say, look, if everyone buys a lawnmower and becomes a sort of a contractor lawnmower, then obviously the economy is going to get a bit lopsided if you do that. So you do want to allow creativity, and I'm just picking on lawn mowing as the most obvious example of this sort of thing, but really we want a whole lot of different things happening all over the place of different sorts, and if we do enable that creativity, we can imagine that people will start to think of all these ideas that become possible.
Just to, actually on the political realities of UBI, I guess I would quickly like to highlight that many people might think UBI sounds nice, and I guess sort of isn't it inevitable? But I personally feel, if we just leave it for the Labor Party, Liberal Party to implement one day, the major parties are risk averse. They've already won. They're already in power. So why would they?
I will give one of my snide observations that both political parties have been burnt. Now, the Liberal Party have been burnt with Turnbull. That was their experiment with a decent sort of person who was a small L Liberal, a reasonably progressive sort of person as leader. And I think he was fed into battle with one hand tied behind his back because he couldn't actually take initiatives on global warming and so on. But so the Liberals had their experiment with a progressive leader, and now they've got from that. Now they're feeling burnt by that. And Labor, they had Shorten, who went in with a grand plan for tax reform. And I think Shorten had some very good ideas, but it was sort of unfairly targeted and torpedoed. So I think so Labor has been burnt as well. So it's actually very hard to get parties to be creative these days, and I guess you need that third force to actually push them, drag them in the direction that they really should
ideas,
be. That they should be going.
I think as well, like Bill Shorten, he could have sold some of his ideas better. And I think, this is before he had his $300,000 speechwriter. So
I guess I'm being a little bit partisan there, but I think the Libs were doing a bit of a wrecking campaign. Let's say, the Libs will claim that Labor runs scare campaigns over Medicare. And who knows, maybe they're onto something. And then Labor will say that the Libs run a scare campaign over the details of the tax package they're putting forward. So everybody does it, I suppose.
Well, actually, so we said that universal basic income is like sort of too innovative, too different for Liberal or Labor to ever get behind it. Yeah. If we look at, let's think about recent Labor ways of addressing, the cost of living. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the fossil fuel subsidies they give out to everybody. They call it energy bill relief, I think they call it.
Yes.
And the notion is like, let's give, these taxes we've collected from you, let's give it back to you. And, it's really just one pot of money, but they say it's because of energy bills. And so now, your energy bills are cheaper because, this money we labelled that this was for your energy.
Well, in a sense, if the tax is coming from everybody and then going to people who are struggling with their bills, maybe it is useful in the longer term. But my interpretation of that energy bill relief is that what it's basically doing, I think, is meaning that we're spending more money creating electricity with gas. That's my suspicion. Basically, there's more expensive ways of creating electricity, and the government is taking money from everybody so that it can make more of this electricity using more expensive means. Now, what would really be better is if we had more electricity generation. But then again, we could also say the price of coal and various other things has increased because of global issues and the war in Ukraine and so on. So, okay, I have to admit, maybe I'm talking out of my head.
Well, in terms of extra generation as well, they have a new idea.
Yeah.
Let's subsidise 30% of the cost of a battery, or I think solar panels as well, maybe.
Yeah.
The Labor Party's going to subsidise 30% of the cost. And, one of the good political outcomes of this is it unlocks more funding from regular civilians. They're going to chip in 70% to build extra energy capacity. But the thing is, why are we building these, backyard energy generators? I mean, it's so reminiscent of, Mao Zedong's backyard steel smelters.
No, well, I guess I guess I wonder about the details of whether it be Greens or Labor in that policy, but in broad terms I'm supportive of that element because people's houses are well adapted to solar panels. You know, nobody's going to be cutting down trees or whatever.
Trees are up. They're like, you know, already, you know, a big chunk of homes already has solar panels. I think it's around a third overall in Australia.
Yeah, and a very small proportion have batteries.
Yeah, and so like, how are we going to get more solar panels? That inevitably means chopping down trees, doesn't it? This argument is inevitably going to arise. Like, hey, you know, Mr. Neighbour, you need to chop down your tree because it's shading my roof, and I want to make money out of solar panels. You know, trees. You know, the small water cycle. It helps us stay cool. You know, it gives us the breeze, gives us bird life.
Well, my understanding is it is closer to noon that you generate most of the solar power. So I guess I'm not across the details. My suspicion is it wouldn't be such an issue as would be made out. But I have to say, we in the Pirate Party, we've actually long been supportive of microgrids, you know, community power. And in a sense, that was before the grid and buying and selling existed in the way that we understand it today. But in a sense, if you have a community and some people have got solar and some people have got batteries and they're sharing amongst themselves using the external grid, you know, I think that's a good thing. It's getting closer to the ideal of a microgrid.
Oh, well, community batteries is one thing, but I guess in terms of generating the energy in the first place, you know, we have deserts. We have, you know, like all the places where they put wind power, you know, you can't fit a wind turbine in your backyard.
Okay, well, the only issue with people's roofs is maybe there's an issue with shading, but I think a lot of places can actually do the solar without worrying about shading. So one of the things is that in summer, when we use our air conditioners, that's when it's likely to be bright sunlight. So there's actually a match between that. So we are actually doing that. And then if you charge your batteries up and then you charge your electric vehicle with that, you know, it's all starting to, I guess, line up like ducks in a row. And I do see that as a positive. Now, I guess part of this debate is about two things. One is the total energy we need, how it's generated. Is it generated using coal? Is it generated using gas? Is it generated using wind or solar? And then you can store it in batteries. Now, the thing is, in summer, solar panels really are very useful because, you know, you basically can make lots of energy. In winter, it gets a bit hard because there's not so much energy coming out of the solar panels, and it's during the day is when you're going to have that load on the system for the heating. Now, one of the benefits of batteries is that you could actually run your gas-powered stations, your coal-powered stations, at a more linear rate during the whole day, and when it's night, and yes, people might be heating a bit, but all the other stuff you get up to doesn't happen at night, so that you can charge the batteries at night from the coal-fired power station and the gas-fired power stations, and then return that power to other people during the day. So there's opportunities there. But absolute worst case, you reduce a great deal of the need for coal-fired power during the summer. Winter gets a bit harder, but that's still a benefit, I think. You know, I think you are talking about overall benefits here. And okay, we've got to worry about, you know, people competing for shade, but you know, even before there were solar panels, there was always the old cliche. You know, I've had a lovely little place, and suddenly someone builds a block of flats next to me, and you know, that's an issue that we have struggled with before there was any issues about solar panels. You know,
I think the thing about blocking out solar panels just complicates the argument even further, and I feel unnecessarily.
Well, there I have to say, you can see we've got a degree of difference there. I think that there are some opportunities for solar panels and batteries, and certainly the Pirate Party has long been in favour of sort of microgrids, and I think this is a variant of microgrids. It's slightly different. It's close to being the original.
Moving on though, John, I guess we were talking earlier about, you know, all these fundamental shifts being proposed by fusion. You know, how do they relate to people's lives? We've covered a bit about, you know, how the housing policy could see changes to, you know, problem gambling, you know, making more innovative investments in Australia. I understand, like, you know, fusion is making, I guess, the best proposals around whistleblowing. And all the impacts that could have. I mean, you know, we've seen...
well, let's say this goes to, I guess, an earlier thing you were talking about, of enabling people with good quality lives. And that's to do with how much money you make and then how much things cost, be it electricity or goods at the supermarket or whatever. But in going through our everyday lives, we do deal with bureaucracy. And, you know, to basically have that bureaucracy streamlined and not have it patronising and not having it invasive, I think that is a very good thing. But the other thing is, yes, within Fusion there's a very strong support for whistleblowing. And let's just say, look, I'm sure we're not the only people saying protection for whistleblowing is a good thing. But if you look at the way politics has played out, there's so many stories you see of whistleblowers who seem to get chewed up and spat at by the legal system. And pretty much, I think the vast majority of voters look on and go, what? And yet we don't seem to get much action on it from the mainstream political parties. But anyway, just to finish that point, so whether it's whistleblowing or bureaucracy, like if we give better support to whistleblowers, we will actually reduce corruption and there will be a productivity boost, and the productivity boost will, I would hope, make all our lives better. So there's all these little things you can...
Corruption undermines our productivity.
That's correct. So there's all these little things you can do, and each one of them individually, I suppose, you know, may not be a grand thing, but they all add up if you put all these policies in the mix together.
I think with the Wellbeing Index, I'm pretty sure that corruption perception is one of the key factors in deciding, you know, how happy everyone is in everyday life. It's people want to be have the assurance that they're not being screwed over.
So that spirit of protecting whistleblowers and making a good effort at it, you know, not only do we give the whistleblowers justice, not only do we have that economic productivity boost, which is a good thing as well, but if people's faith in the system can be improved, then our quality of life improves as well. So, you know, there's all these good things that happen out of that. I think that those stories, we see them so often, and, you know, partially you wonder what the hell's going on with whistleblowing, and partially you wonder what the hell's going on with our legal system, you know.
Yeah, actually, and John, you mentioned before that, you know, maybe we're not the only party to care about this. Maybe I'm being a bit more cynical, but, you know, let's think back to the 2022 election. Some of the big topics were, you know, climate action, a national anti-corruption commission. We got the anti-corruption commission, and it's turned out to be so underwhelming.
Yes.
And, you know, Labor was talking a big game about climate change, but, you know, they've ended up, you know, approving something like 40 new coal and gas projects during the term, and, you know, there doesn't seem to be enough pushback. And, you know, like the Teals were amongst some of the people last time who were saying that, you know, we need the anti-corruption commission, all this sort of thing, and yet so for instance, one of the Teal candidates, I'm getting their email newsletter, I got an email just a few days ago saying that they've decided upon the policies for the election, versus, you know, we've been talking about whistleblowing for years. And they're deciding their policies now, just a few weeks ago.
Okay, you're actually uncovering some of my ignorance, because I have been thinking about whistleblowing quite a lot. Now, NAC, there's a few things that NAC didn't do. They don't have public hearings, or at least if they do have public hearings, there's some convoluted hoops they have to jump through. But there have been a lot of commentators that say, look, you know, overseas experience is that you need to have public hearings for a NAC to be effective.
Oh, for sure.
Now, one of the things that I believe it was the Liberal Party was saying, yes, let's have an act, but let's not have public hearings, because basically people's careers can be destroyed by
a rumour.
By rumour. And that is one of the things about our legal system is, here is this accusation, and maybe we need to follow it through, but it could be genuine, or it could be someone's just running some sort of a revenge scheme, you know, I mean...
Well, I guess as well, the Liberal Party, there are a lot of so-called rumours, shall we say, against members of the Liberal Party.
Yes. So, well, okay, I guess that's something to think about there, but my puzzle is, I would have thought that if Labor wanted this enough, the Teals could have gotten on board and they would have had a majority to go through Parliament. It is my understanding that I think it was the Liberal Party influence that sort of made that it wasn't, that it didn't have public hearings. So you're uncovering a bit of ignorance on me. We know the NAC doesn't have public hearings, but how and why did that happen? I mean, I'm a little ignorant on the details myself. But one thing we could say is, in terms of the promise Labor gave and in terms of the whole political system, it doesn't seem to have developed a genuine thing about whistleblowing. And I think, you know, I mean, I'm not the only person to sort of say, look at how that whistleblowing has been treated. Why do they not have a defence of, look, I have basically revealed something harmful that is in the public interest, and basically, that should trump all the other legal issues at hand. Why is that not happening? And I'm puzzled. So there's so much room for so much more activity on the whistleblower front.
Yeah, I guess as well, actually, in terms of our whistleblowing policy, our housing policy, I guess that's one of the differences we get in Fusion, as opposed to, let's say the Teals, for instance. We've got, thousands of members all across the country, experts in their fields, thinking about these topics for years, coming up with sensible policies, versus, I guess, the Teal approach is more, we'll listen to you. And so when I was researching our housing policy, for instance, I saw a submission by Kylie Tink, the member for North Sydney. And so she'd sent out 200-person survey asking people, what are the problems with housing and how do we fix it? And the submission ended up being, 2 or 3 pages of essentially nothing. For whatever reason, these 200 people in the survey couldn't come up to the solution to the housing crisis. And I guess, how could you expect that?
Well, I suppose, if I were running something like that, the way to do it is to sort of say, look, who's particularly interested in housing? Let's get 15 or 20 people and basically have a seminar where we all talk it through, we listen to some experts, and as people in the community, we start to develop an informed opinion based on sort of being exposed to these ideas. But let me say, that is one of the things. I mean, I read the papers a bit and so on, and you have an article here, an article there, and it is really difficult to pull it together and sort of make sense of things.
I mean, that's why, I was working on the housing policy with Simon Milspec. I spent months on this, reading academic papers, reading books. I mean, I think that's what it requires. It requires, months of dedication to fixing these fundamental issues in our society. It's not something... I mean...
Well, partially you've got a plan, and partially the plan has to be credible. So I suppose that's the combination there, because the ideas are out there. You have to bring them together and synthesize them into a package, and a package that appeals, and hopefully you're a credible person bringing that across. And obviously that is what we're hoping is the case. But, the other side of things is, another observation is we can all vote, but only a very small number of us can lobby.
Yes.
Right? So you wonder if, while we all vote, what's actually determining what's going on in Parliament? And that is a thing that is the concern. It's the big end of town, the lobbying interest, that sort of thing.
I would clarify that where we differ from others in terms of lobbying. So I guess with independents in general, not just the Teals, their approach always seems to be, I'm one of you. I'm not a career politician. Trust me. Just I don't have all the details yet. Just vote for me. Trust me, I'll listen to you, and then we'll sort of decide the details later.
Yeah.
Versus Fusion's approach is very much, we've fleshed out some ideas.
Yeah.
Here are the ideas in detail. If you'd like to look at them, if you approve them, then we're the party for you.
Yeah.
And so I guess there's just not much room. After we get elected, we've already promised so much of what we're going to do. There's not much room.
Well, I
for us to
suppose
be
what we're trying to do is offer something that is different to the mainstream political parties, and hope that what we're offering is appealing. So
but I guess as well, compared to Liberal and Labor, making it appealing, would be nice, but that's not our number one objective. Our number one objective is to come up with policies that would improve Australia.
Okay, we don't want to make it appealing, but we hope that it might be. That's a different sentiment there.
I guess, actually, yeah, so John, finishing up, so we've agreed, we need to make sure that, the people understand our policies or the implications that they would have.
Yes.
We hope that they're appealing in that, they fix things. Is there any final thoughts we have about, especially Bennelong?
Well, I would say, for myself, for the political party and the general public, yes, there's a lot of energy that comes out at the election, but in a sense, and I don't want to just talk about Fusion here. We've got a big political landscape with lots of political parties and lots of different ideas. But I can only say, think about the political world, and not just during elections. Not just during the lead up to the elections, because maybe people have some good ideas. Maybe you want to reach out to Fusion between elections and make some suggestions, and maybe we'll take them on board, maybe we won't, but at least there's a bit more of that interaction going on, which I think would be a very healthy thing, because all these things get crystallised and focused just in the lead up to the election. But it's a richer world, and there's more possibilities than that. And sure, I'm standing and I hope for the best, but there's a bigger world out there than just elections, I suppose.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
Authorised by Owen Miller for the Fusion Party, Brunswick, Victoria.